A man in a raincoat walks into the fog and never walks out. Welcome to Maigret's Casebook. I am your host, Freddie. Let me know where in the world you're tuning in from. This community's amazing. You make every mystery more meaningful. Here we go. The rain came down in sheets, drumming a relentless rhythm on the cobblestone streets of Paris. It was the kind of night that seemed to wash away the city's sins, only to reveal darker ones lurking beneath. In the narrow alleyway behind Rue des Capucines, a small crowd had gathered despite the deluge, their umbrellas bobbing like black mushrooms under the flickering gaslight. At the center of their grim fascination lay a body. A man sprawled face down. In a puddle, his raincoat fanned out around him like the wings of some fallen bird. Inspector Jules Maigret stood at the edge of the scene, his pipe clenched between his teeth, the brim of his hat pulled low against the wet. He didn't hurry forward, didn't bark orders at the uniformed officers cordoning off the alley. Instead, he watched, letting the rain soak into his overcoat as he studied the tableau. The man in the raincoat was motionless, unmistakably dead, yet there was something staged about the whole affair, as if someone had posed him just so, a piece of theatre meant to confound. "Evening, Inspector," muttered Sergeant Lucas, approaching, with a notebook in hand, his face pale under the sheen of rain. "We've got a real puzzle here. No witnesses, at least none who'll talk. Body was found by a baker heading to his shop not half an hour ago. Looks like a clean job, one stab wound to the chest, straight through the heart. No struggle, no blood trail, just him lying there." Maigret nodded, his eyes never leaving the body. "And the raincoat?" he asked, his voice low, almost swallowed by the storm. Lucas hesitated, then gestured to the garment. "That's the odd part. It's not even buttoned, flung open like he was showing off the wound. And look at the pockets, stuffed full. I haven't touched anything yet, but there's papers, maybe keys, sticking out. Doesn't look like robbery. Wallet's still on him." Maigret crouched beside the body, ignoring the cold seeping through his trousers as the puddle soaked his knees. Up close, the man appeared ordinary, middle-aged, unremarkable features, a faint stubble on his jaw. But the raincoat, a cheap, drab thing, seemed almost too large for him, the sleeves hanging past his wrists. Maigret's gloved fingers hovered over the nearest pocket, then carefully tugged out a folded piece of paper. It was damp, but intact, and as he unfolded it under the weak beam of a constable's lantern, he saw a single word scrawled in hurried ink. "Montparnasse." "Montparnasse," he murmured, tasting the word. A district, a station, a graveyard, too many meanings to pin down. He slipped the note into his own pocket for safekeeping and continued his search. The other pocket yielded a key, old and tarnished, with no tag or markings. The wallet, as Lucas had said, held a modest sum of francs and a card identifying the man as Pierre Fournier, address unknown. Nothing else, no photographs, no letters, just the barest skeleton of an identity. Straightening up, Maigret felt the weight of the mystery settle on his shoulders like the rain itself. A man stabbed with surgical precision, left in an alley with no sign of struggle, his belongings untouched. But his raincoat opened to the world like an invitation. And that word, Montparnasse. It was too deliberate to be random, too vague to be helpful. A clue, perhaps, but one that seemed to mock him. "Get him to the morgue," Maigret instructed Lucas, his tone clipped. "I want a full report by morning, time of death, any trace on the blade, everything, and canvass the area again. Someone saw something, even if they don't know it yet." As the body was lifted onto a stretcher, the raincoat flapping awkwardly in the wind, Maigret, lingered in the alley, his gaze tracing the narrow walls, the overflowing gutters, the shuttered windows above. The scene felt sterile, despite the grime. No footprints in the mud, no dropped weapon, no sign of a scuffle. It was as if Pierre Fournier had simply appeared here, already dead, a gift from the storm. He turned back toward the street, the murmur of the crowd fading behind him, and lit his pipe with a match that hissed against the damp. Montparnasse. The word gnawed at him, a splinter in his mind. He knew the district well, its bohemian cafes, its sprawling cemetery, its labyrinth of secrets. But why leave such a clue? Was it a destination, a meeting place, or something more cryptic? The next hours passed in a blur of routine. Back at the Quai des Orfèvres, Maigret pored over what little they had. Pierre Fournier, it seemed, was a ghost. No records of employment, no family to speak of, no criminal history. The address on his card led to a dilapidated rooming house near Belleville, but the landlord claimed Fournier had vanished weeks ago, leaving behind nothing but a few threadbare shirts. Quiet sort, the man had grunted over the phone, kept to himself, paid in cash, always late. By dawn, the morgue report confirmed what Maigret had suspected, a single, expert thrust, likely from a thin blade like a stiletto. Death had been instantaneous, somewhere between midnight and 2 in the morning. No defensive wounds, no signs of a fight. Fournier hadn't resisted, or hadn't had the chance to. Trace evidence was minimal. The rain had washed away much, though a faint residue of grease on the raincoat's collar hinted at industrial work, perhaps a factory or garage. Maigret sat at his desk, the window behind him framing a grey dripping Paris, and turned the key over in his fingers. It was heavy, the kind used for older locks, maybe a gate or a storage unit. He paired it in his mind with that scrawled word, Montparnasse. A hunch began to form, slow and stubborn like smoke curling from his pipe. Cemeteries had gates, didn't they? And Montparnasse was home to one of the largest in the city, a place of forgotten names and hidden corners. He rose, pulling on his still damp coat, and headed out into the morning. The rain had lessened to a drizzle, but the chill lingered, seeping into his bones as he boarded a tram south toward the 14th arrondissement. The cemetery of Montparnasse loomed ahead, its high walls and iron gates a silent sentinel over the dead. Maigret stepped through the entrance, the key a cold weight in his pocket, and began to wander the gravel paths past weathered tombstones and crumbling mausoleums. He wasn't sure what he was looking for, not yet. But he felt it, that pull of instinct, the certainty that Fournier's final message pointed here. The raincoat, the stab wound, the staged body. It all spoke of purpose, of a story unfinished. As he walked, the keys seemed to grow heavier, as if it too knew its destination. Half an hour passed before he found it, a small, overlooked crypt near the cemetery's edge, its iron gate rusted but intact, the lock ancient and scarred. Maigret slipped the key from his pocket, his pulse quickening as it turned with a reluctant groan. The gate creaked open, revealing a dank stairway descending into shadow. Whatever Pierre Fournier had been, whoever had silenced him, the answer, or at least the next piece of it, lay below. Maigret descended, the darkness closing around him, and for the first time that day he felt the thrill of the hunt sharpening his senses. The man in the raincoat wasn't just a victim, he was a map, and Maigret intended to follow it to the end. The air inside the crypt was damp and heavy, carrying the musty scent of stone and neglect. Maigret's footsteps echoed faintly as he descended the narrow stairway, his hand grazing the rough wall for balance. At the bottom, a small chamber opened up, its low ceiling forcing him to stoop slightly. A single lantern, long since extinguished, hung from a rusted hook, and the floor was strewn with debris, crumbling bits of plaster, a broken bottle, the faint outlines of footprints in the dust. But it was the far wall that drew his attention immediately. A battered wooden trunk, its lock hanging loose, as if recently forced open. Maigret approached cautiously, his pipe now cold between his teeth, every sense alert. He crouched beside the trunk, noting the scratches around the lock, fresh, made by a clumsy hand or a hurried one. Inside, the contents were sparse but telling. A bundle of yellowed letters tied with twine, a tarnished pocket watch, and a scrap of cloth that looked suspiciously like the same drab material as Pierre Fournier's raincoat. He lifted the cloth first, turning it over in his gloved hands. A faint stain marred one edge, blood, perhaps, though too old to be Fournier's. The letters, when he untied them, bore no names, only dates from a decade past, written in a shaky, urgent hand. Phrases leapt out at him. The debt must be
paid, and they'll find us if we stay. Cryptic, but heavy with unspoken menace.
He pocketed the letters for later, his mind already turning over their implications. A debt, a threat, a hidden past. Fournier's death was no random act, no petty street crime. The raincoat, the key, the crypt, it was all a thread in a larger weave, one he was only beginning to glimpse. As he straightened, his eyes caught something else, half buried under a pile of rubble near the trunk, a small brass button, its surface scratched, but still gleaming faintly in the dim light, filtering from the stairwell. It didn't match Fournier's raincoat, which bore plain black buttons. Someone else had been here, perhaps in haste, leaving this tiny trace behind. Maigret slipped the button into his pocket alongside the key and the note, a quiet satisfaction flickering through him. The authorities, Lucas and the others, would comb the alley near Rue des Capucines for days, chasing fingerprints and witness statements that the rain had obliterated. They'd file reports, follow protocol, and miss the undercurrent altogether. But Maigret had always hunted differently. It wasn't the obvious that revealed a crime. It was the overlooked, the misplaced, the whisper of something out of step. A button in a crypt, a word like Montparnasse, scrawled on damp paper. These were the language of deception, and he was fluent in it. He climbed back into the grey drizzle of the cemetery, securing the crypt's gate behind him with a soft clang. The rain had picked up again, a fine mist that clung to his coat as he made his way toward the exit. His next move was clear. The letters needed deciphering, and the button might point to a tailor or a coat shop, someone who could place its owner. But first, there was the matter of the rooming house in Belleville. Fournier's landlord had sounded brusque over the phone, too quick to dismiss the dead man as a nobody. Maigret knew better. Nobodies didn't die with keys to hidden crypts in their pockets. The tram ride to Belleville was crowded, the air thick with the smell of wet wool and cheap tobacco. Maigret stood near the back, one hand on the overhead strap, his gaze distant as he pieced together the fragments in his mind. Fournier, stabbed with precision, left in an alley like a message. A raincoat too big for him, opened to display the wound. A key, a crypt, old letters full of dread. And now a button, foreign to the scene, a silent witness to another's presence. Someone was orchestrating this, dangling clues just out of reach, testing him. The thought didn't anger him, it sharpened his focus. The rooming house was as dilapidated As he'd imagined, a sagging building of cracked plaster and grimy windows tucked between a butcher's shop and a tavern. The landlord, a wiry man named Gérard with a cigarette perpetually dangling from his lip, met him at the door with a scowl. "I already told your lot everything," he muttered, wiping his hands on a stained apron. Fournier was a tenant, nothing more. Paid late, kept quiet, disappeared a few weeks back. That's it. Maigret didn't respond immediately. Instead, he stepped past Gérard into the cramped hallway, his eyes scanning the peeling wallpaper, the uneven floorboards, the faint smell of mildew. "Quiet, you say?" he mused aloud, his voice calm but carrying an edge. "Yet you remember him well enough. Did he have visitors? Arguments? Anything you might have forgotten to mention?" Gérard shifted on his feet, his scowl deepening, but a flicker of unease passed through his eyes. "No visitors," he said too quickly. "Like I said, he kept to himself. If he had troubles, he didn't bring 'em here." Maigret nodded, as if satisfied, but his gaze had already caught something Gérard hadn't noticed, or hoped he wouldn't. On a small table by the stairs, half buried under a stack of unopened mail, lay a crumpled receipt from a pawnshop. The ink was smudged, but the name Fournier was legible, dated just 3 days before the murder. Beside it, almost hidden, was a torn scrap of fabric, the same drab shade as the raincoat and the piece from the crypt. Maigret's hand hovered over it for a moment before he picked it up, turning it over casually as if it were nothing. "Careless of someone to leave this lying around," he remarked, watching Gérard closely. The landlord's face tightened, his cigarette twitching as he exhaled a sharp puff of smoke. "That's just rubbish," he stammered. "Tenants leave all sorts of junk. Means nothing." "Perhaps," Maigret said, slipping the fabric into his pocket. But he saw the lie in Gérard's too stiff shoulders, the way his eyes darted toward the stairs as if expecting someone to appear. The landlord knew more than he let on, maybe not the whole story, but enough to be nervous. A bribe, a threat, or simple fear could explain that twitch of guilt. Maigret didn't press further, not yet. Pushing too hard now would only make Gérard clam up tighter. Instead, he tipped his hat with a polite nod. "I'll be back if I have more questions. Keep that memory sharp, Monsieur Gérard. It might save you trouble." The warning hung in the air as he turned toward the door, feeling the weight of the man's stare on his back. Outside, the drizzle had thickened again, and Maigret paused under the awning, lighting his pipe with a slow, deliberate motion. The receipt, the fabric, Gérard's unease, they were threads just like the button and the letters. They wove together, but the pattern was still blurred, a tapestry of deceit he couldn't yet read. His next stop would be the pawn shop listed on the receipt, a place near the canal in the 19th arrondissement. Fournier had sold something there, or bought something, just before his death. And if the fabric scraps were any indication, the raincoat itself might hold more significance than he'd first thought. Was it a disguise, a symbol, or merely a shroud for a doomed man? Maigret exhaled a plume of smoke into the damp air, his mind racing ahead. The man in the raincoat was speaking to him still, through every misplaced item and nervous glance. And Maigret was listening, closer now to the truth, or to the next layer of lies. The drizzle had turned to a steady patter by the time Maigret reached the pawn shop near the Canal Saint-Martin. The narrow storefront, wedged between a laundromat and a crumbling warehouse, bore a faded sign reading Antiquités et Curiosités, Achat et Vente, in peeling gold letters. A bell jingled as he pushed open the door, the smell of dust and old leather enveloping him. The shop was a maze of cluttered shelves, brass candlesticks, tarnished silverware, stacks of yellowed books, all presided over by a hunched man behind. The counter, his spectacles perched low on a beak-like nose. Inspector Maigret, Quai des Orfèvres, he introduced himself, pulling the crumpled receipt from his pocket and laying it on the counter. This came from your shop, a transaction with a Pierre Fournier 3 days ago. What can you tell me about him? The pawnbroker, who muttered his name as Monsieur Dubois, squinted at the receipt, then at Maigret, with a wariness that seemed habitual rather than specific to this moment. "Ah, yes, I remember him," Dubois said, his voice raspy, like paper crumpling. "Quiet fellow, shifty eyes, came in to sell a pocket watch, nothing fancy, but old, maybe an heirloom. I gave
him 20 francs for it, that's all. Didn't ask questions, didn't get answers. My business, you understand, thrives on discretion."
Maigret nodded, his expression unreadable, though he noted the slight tremor in Dubois' fingers as he adjusted his spectacles. "Discretion," he repeated, letting the word hang. "Yet you remember his eyes. Shifty, you said. Anything else?"
Strike you as odd? Did he seem nervous, hurried? Mention anyone he might have been meeting? Dubois hesitated, his gaze flickering toward the back of the shop before returning to Maigret. Not nervous, no, more resigned, I'd say, like a man who'd already lost something bigger than a watch. He muttered something about needing the money quick, but nothing specific. Took the francs and left. That's all I've got for you, Inspector.
Maigret sensed the half-truth in the man's tone, the way his words came too rehearsed, too tidy. He didn't press immediately, instead letting his eyes wander over the cluttered counter. A ledger lay open, entries scribbled in a hurried hand, and near it a small tray of loose buttons, none matching the brass one in his pocket, but the sight reminded him of the traces Fournier had left behind. "And you're sure he was alone?" he asked, his tone conversational, almost idle. "Alone as far as I saw," Dubois replied, a touch too quickly. "Door's right there, bell rings every time. I'd have heard if someone else came in." But his fingers twitched again, and Maigret caught the faint sheen of sweat on his brow, despite the chilly air of the shop. Someone had instructed Dubois to keep quiet, or scared him into it. The pawnbroker was a small fish, likely uninvolved in Fournier's death, but he knew more than 20 francs worth of information. Maigret tipped his hat, pocketing the receipt. "If your memory sharpens, Monsieur Dubois, you know where to find me. Discretion cuts both ways." The warning lingered as he stepped back into the rain, the bell jingling behind him. Dubois was hiding something, a name, a face, a whispered threat. The resigned air Fournier had carried wasn't just poverty. It was dread, and someone had capitalized on it. Maigret lit his pipe under the overhang of a nearby building, the smoke curling into the damp air as he considered his next move. From the canal, he made his way back toward Belleville, intent on circling back to Gérard, the landlord. But first, he stopped at a café 2 streets over from the rooming house, a cramped place frequented by locals who might have crossed paths with Fournier. The bartender, a stout woman with grey streaks in her hair, wiped down the counter with a rag as she eyed Maigret warily. "Police, eh?" she grunted when he showed his badge. "What's this about? I don't deal in trouble." "Pierre Fournier," Maigret said, sliding onto a stool and ordering a coffee to soften the edge of his inquiry. "Lived nearby at Gérard's place. A quiet man, they say. Dead now, stabbed last night. Did you know him? See him with anyone?" The bartender, Madame Claire, she called herself, poured his coffee with a steady hand, but her mouth tightened. "Seen him once or twice, aye. Came in for a glass of cheap wine, never stayed long. Always alone, far as I recall. Didn't talk much, just stared into his drink like he was waiting for the world to end. Sad sort, if you ask me. But no trouble.
Not here. Her words echoed Dubois' description: resigned, solitary, haunted. Yet Maigret caught the way her eyes slid toward the door mid-sentence, a fleeting glance as if checking for eavesdroppers.
Always alone? He pressed gently, sipping the bitter coffee. No one ever waited for him outside, maybe, or followed him in? Madame Claire hesitated, her rag pausing on the counter. Well, there was one time, maybe a week back, a fellow came in right after Fournier, sat at the far table, didn't order, just watched, wore a dark coat, hat pulled low.
I figured he was just another down and out, but Fournier looked rattled. Left quick, didn't finish his drink, that's the only odd thing I remember. Maigret's pulse quickened, though his face betrayed nothing. A watcher, a shadow. It fit with the staged precision of the murder, the cryptic clues.
This man in the dark coat, did he come back after Fournier left? Speak to anyone? She shook her head, resuming her wiping with forced nonchalance. Not that I saw. Disappeared as quick as he came. Could have been nothing, Inspector. This ain't the brightest corner of Paris. Plenty of odd types pass through. Could have been nothing, she said, but her tone suggested otherwise. Maigret thanked her, leaving a coin on the counter, and stepped back into the rain. Two witnesses now, two versions of Fournier, a lonely ghost to Dubois, a haunted man to Madame Claire, and both carried the scent of omission, of details withheld. The dark-coated watcher was a new piece, a shadow behind the shadow, but too vague to grasp yet. He returned to Gerard's rooming house as the afternoon waned, the sky a bruised grey overhead. The landlord was sweeping the stoop, his movements jerky, and his scowl deepened at the sight of Maigret. "Back already?" Gerard muttered, gripping the broom like a weapon. "I've got nothing new for you. Told you everything." "Everything?" Maigret echoed, stopping just out of reach of the broom's arc. He pulled the scrap of fabric from his pocket, holding it up for Gerard to see. "This matches Fournier's raincoat. Found it downstairs among your clutter. And I hear he wasn't as alone as you claim. Someone was watching him, maybe someone you've seen skulking around. Care to revise your story, or shall I dig deeper myself?" Gerard's face paled, the broom stilled, and for a moment Maigret thought he'd crack. But instead the landlord squared his shoulders, his voice dropping to a hiss. "I don't know what you're on about, Inspector. That rag could be anyone's, and I don't spy on my tenants or their shadows. Fournier's dead, and I'm sorry."
"For it. But I've got rent to collect and a building to run. Leave me out of whatever mess he got into." The defiance was brittle, laced with fear. Gerard was holding back, a name, a threat, perhaps a payoff to stay silent.
Maigret pocketed the fabric again, his gaze steady. "Messes have a way of spreading, Monsieur Gerard. If you're caught in one, better to untangle yourself now than later." He turned away, feeling the landlord's glare boring into his back, and walked down the street, the rain pattering against his hat. Three voices now, Dubois, Madame Claire, Gerard, each weaving a different thread of Fournier's last days. A resigned seller, a haunted drinker, a tenant with unseen enemies, contradictions whispered beneath their words, the absence of companions, clashing with a lurking watcher, the insistence on normalcy undercut by nervous tics and darting eyes. Someone, or several someones, wanted Fournier's story buried with him, but their lies were fraying at the edges. Maigret paused at the corner, relighting his pipe as he sifted through the discrepancies. The dark-coated figure was key, a link between Fournier's dread and his death. And the raincoat, the crypt, the button, every clue pointed to a past debt, a hidden reckoning. The voices of deception surrounded him, but amidst their half-truths, he sensed a pattern forming, faint but growing. Whoever had orchestrated this was close, watching as keenly as Maigret hunted. The next step wasn't just to listen, it was to force the hidden hand to move. The rain had eased into a thin mist as twilight settled over Paris, casting the streets in a muted grey that mirrored Maigret's mood. He stood at the corner near Gérard's rooming house, the ember of his pipe glowing faintly as he mulled over the voices he'd heard. Dubois' guarded reticence, Madame Claire's cautious half-truths, Gérard's brittle defiance. Each painted a fragment of Pierre Fournier's final days, but the fragments didn't align, not yet. The dark-coated watcher lingered in his mind, a phantom threading through the lies, while the raincoat, the crypt, and the brass button whispered of a deeper story, one rooted in motives as murky as the evening fog. Maigret knew he couldn't force the truth from reluctant tongues, not without leverage. The clues in his pocket, the letters from the crypt, the receipt, the fabric scrap, were pieces of a puzzle, but the motive remained a maze. Was Fournier's death a settling of scores, a desperate bid for silence, or something colder, more calculated? He needed connections, alibis, and contradictions to unravel the web. With a last pull on his pipe, he decided to start with the pawnbroker's ledger. Dubois had been too quick to shut down questions, and that open book on his counter might hold names or transactions tying Fournier to someone else. He retraced his steps to the Canal Saint-Martin, under the lengthening shadows, the pawn shops. Windows now dim, a single lamp flickering within. The bell jingled as he entered, and Dubois looked up from behind the counter, his spectacles glinting with thinly veiled irritation. "Twice in one day, Inspector. I've told you all I know."
About Fournier. Maigret didn't smile, didn't waste time on pleasantries. "Your ledger, Monsieur Dubois. I'd like a look. Names, dates, items, everything from the past month. Fournier sold a watch, you said. Let's see if anyone else sold pieces of his life, or bought them." Dubois' face tightened, his hands hovering protectively over the book before he relented.
With a grudging shrug, "Fine, but you'll find nothing, just trinkets and rubbish, desperate people parting with scraps." He slid the ledger across the counter, his eyes never leaving Maigret's face, as if gauging how much trouble this might bring. Maigret flipped through the pages, his fingers methodical, pausing at entries near the date on Fournier's receipt. The pawnbroker hadn't lied. Fournier's name appeared alongside the pocket watch, sold for 20 francs. But 2 days earlier, another entry caught his eye. A man named Victor Leclerc had pawned a set of old keys, described as rusted,
miscellaneous.
The description matched the key Maigret had found on Fournier, the one that opened the crypt in Montparnasse. And Leclerc's name appeared again, a week prior, selling a tarnished brass button, likely not the exact one in Maigret's pocket, but close enough to raise a flag. Coincidence, perhaps, but Maigret doubted it. Greed often tied men together in petty ways, and pawn shops were crossroads for debts and desperation. "Tell me about Victor Leclerc," Maigret said, his voice low but firm, pinning Dubois with a stare. "He's been here often, sold keys, buttons, small things. Did he know Fournier? Meet him here, maybe?" Dubois adjusted his spectacles, a nervous tick. "Leclerc's a regular, yes. Scavenger type. Picks up junk from the streets, sells what he can. I don't ask about his business or his friends. Might have seen Fournier, might not. I don't play matchmaker, Inspector." Another half-truth, Maigret noted, but he logged the name in his mind. Victor Leclerc. Scavenger or opportunist, possibly a link between Fournier and the crypt's secrets. Greed could drive a man to sell relics of someone else's past, but it could also make him an accomplice, knowingly or not. Maigret closed the ledger with a soft thud. "I'll find Leclerc myself. If he comes in, tell him Inspector Maigret has questions. Discretion, as you say, only goes so far." Leaving the shop, Maigret felt the maze of motives tightening. Greed was one thread, Fournier selling heirlooms, Leclerc peddling scraps, but it didn't explain the precision of the murder, the staged body in the alley. Revenge, perhaps? The letters from the crypt hinted at old debts, unresolved threats. He needed to trace Leclerc, but first he returned to the Quai des Orfèvres to cross-check names and dig into Fournier's scant records for any ties to the suspects emerging. At his desk, under the harsh light of a single lamp, Maigret spread out his notes alongside the morgue's latest findings. Sergeant Lucas had tracked down a former co-worker of Fournier's from a factory near Belleville, a man named Henri Dupont, who'd been laid off alongside Fournier 2 years prior. Dupont, Lucas reported, had a grudge, claimed Fournier had blamed him for a workplace accident, costing them both their jobs. Revenge simmered there, a bitter motive, but Dupont's alibi was ironclad. He'd been in a hospital with a broken leg the night of the murder, confirmed by staff. Still, Maigret noted the name, grudges lingered, and even bedridden men could hire others for dirty work. Then there was Gérard, the landlord, whose fear hinted at coercion or blackmail. Maigret suspected Gérard knew the dark-coated watcher, perhaps sheltered him or turned a blind eye for a price. Fear as a motive, fear of exposure, of retribution, could bind a man to silence as tightly as greed bound him to profit. Maigret tapped his pencil against the desk, recalling Gérard's darting eyes, his insistence that Fournier was a nobody. Too insistent, too defensive. He'd send Lucas to tail Gérard tomorrow, see if the landlord slipped up under unseen pressure. Madame Claire's story added another layer, jealousy perhaps, or a proxy for something darker. The watcher in the dark coat hadn't just unnerved. Fournier? He'd driven him to flee. Was it a rival, a creditor, or someone tied to the crypt's past? Maigret reread the letters from the trunk, their vague warnings of debts and pursuit. If Fournier had crossed someone years ago, jealousy over a shared secret, or betrayal over a broken pact, could fuel a decade-long vendetta, culminating in that precise personal stab to the heart. And now Victor Leclerc, the scavenger, entered the frame. Greed, certainly, but possibly ignorance too. Had he stumbled on Fournier's possessions, or been handed them to fence? Maigret called in a favour with a contact at the local precinct near the canal, requesting a quick search for Leclerc's haunts, flophouses, back alleys, anywhere a scavenger might hole up. If Leclerc held the keys to the crypt before Fournier, he might know who else frequented that shadowed place. As midnight approached, Maigret leaned back in his chair, the weight of the case pressing down like the damp chill outside. Every suspect had a reason to circle Fournier's life, yet no single theory wove all the threads together. Greed linked Dubois and Leclerc, petty transactions hiding larger stakes. Revenge burned in Dupont, though distance dulled its edge. Fear shackled Gérard, silencing him about the watcher. Jealousy or betrayal shadowed Madame Claire's account, a personal enmity haunting Fournier's last steps, and the crypt's letters suggested a past so fraught it could encompass all these motives, debts unpaid in coin or blood. Maigret lit his pipe, the smoke curling upward as he sifted through alibis and connections. Dupont was sidelined for now, but not dismissed. Gérard's fear needed cracking, perhaps through subtle pressure via Lucas. Madame Claire's watcher, tied to the alley's staging, someone had orchestrated Fournier's death as a message, not just an end. And Leclerc was the loose thread. If he'd pawned the crypt key, he'd crossed paths with Fournier's doom, willingly or not. The web of deception was intricate, each strand pulling in opposing directions, yet Maigret felt the centre drawing nearer. Fournier's raincoat, opened to the world, wasn't just a corpse's shroud, it was a challenge, a taunt from someone who knew the past and wielded it like a blade. Maigret's next move was to find Leclerc, to tug that thread and see where it led. In this maze of motives, one truth was clear. The man in the raincoat hadn't died by accident, and whoever killed him was still close, watching every step Maigret took. The dawn broke over Paris with a pale, watery light, the city stirring.
Awake under a shroud of mist.
Maigret had barely slept, his mind churning through the tangled motives and half-truths that surrounded Pierre Fournier's death. He sat at his desk at the Quai des Orfèvres, the clutter of notes and evidence before him bathed in the dim glow of his lamp. The crypt's letters, the brass button, the pawn-shop ledger, each piece gnawed at him, but it was Victor Leclerc's name, the scavenger who'd pawned keys and buttons, that held his focus. If Leclerc had touched Fournier's past, he might hold the key to the present, literally and figuratively. By mid-morning, Maigret's contact at the local precinct near the Canal Saint-Martin delivered. Leclerc had been spotted in a derelict bar near the water, a haunt for drifters and petty thieves. Maigret wasted no time pulling on his damp overcoat and heading out into the grey chill. The bar was a squat, grimy hole in the wall, its windows streaked with dirt, the air inside thick with stale beer and cigarette smoke. Leclerc wasn't hard to spot, slouched at a corner table, a wiry man with a weathered face nursing a cloudy glass of absinthe. His eyes darted up as Maigret approached, narrowing with the instinctive wariness of someone who'd dodged the law before. "Victor Leclerc," Maigret said, sliding into the seat opposite without invitation, his voice low but carrying weight. "I'm Inspector Maigret. You've been selling things at Dubois' pawn shop. Keys, buttons, bits of someone's life. One of those keys
Opened a crypt in Montparnasse. A man named Pierre Fournier carried it when he died. Tell me what you know and don't waste my time with lies."
Leclerc's fingers tightened around his glass, his gaze flickering toward the door before returning to Maigret. "I don't know any Fournier," he muttered, his voice rough, edged with drink. "I pick up what I find, keys, trinkets, whatever. Streets are full of junk, sold a few things to Dubois, sure. Didn't ask where they came from, didn't care. If some poor sap ended up dead with one of them, that's not on me." Maigret leaned forward, his eyes boring into Leclerc's. "A sap who ended up stabbed, left in an alley, like a message. That key you sold opened a place tied to old debts, old threats. Where did you get it? Who gave it to you or sold it to?"
"You?" Leclerc shifted, unease creeping into his posture, but his jaw set stubbornly. "Found it, like I said, near the cemetery Montparnasse way, couple weeks back. Just lying in the gutter, rusted old thing. Thought it might fetch a franc or two. That's all. I'm no killer, Inspector. Check my hands. Never held a blade in my life."
Maigret studied him, noting the tremble in his voice, the way his story hung together just a little too neatly. A scavenger could stumble on a key, true, but near the cemetery tied to Fournier's clue. Too convenient. Still, he had no proof to contradict Leclerc, not yet. He pulled the brass button from his pocket, laying it on the table between them. "Recognize this. You sold something like it to Dubois. Found this in the crypt. Yours?" Leclerc's eyes widened for a split second before he masked it, shrugging. "Could be. Sold a few buttons. Cheap stuff. Don't remember every piece. Like I said, I just pick up what's lying around." But the flicker of recognition was there, and Maigret logged it. Leclerc was a link, maybe unwitting, maybe coerced, but a link nonetheless. Before Maigret could press further, the bar door swung open and Sergeant Lucas strode in, his face flushed with urgency. "Inspector, we've got something big," he said, keeping his voice low as he approached the table. Gerard, the landlord, cracked under a bit of tailing. Confessed to seeing someone with Fournier the night before the murder. Describes a man in a dark coat, sharp features, meeting. "Fournier outside the rooming house," said Fournier, looked terrified, argued with the man, then stormed off. Gerard swears he didn't tell us sooner because he was paid off, 50 francs to keep quiet. We've got a sketch based on his description and a name, Etienne Moreau, small-time enforcer known for debt collection and rough work. Picked him up an hour ago near Belleville. He's in custody now. Maigret's pulse quickened, though his face remained impassive. The dark-coated watcher, Madame Claire's phantom, now Gerard's confession, had a name, Etienne Moreau. It fit the staging of the murder, the precision of the stab wound. A hired blade, perhaps, settling a debt, as the crypt letters hinted. He glanced at Leclerc, who'd gone still, his glass forgotten, clearly listening. "Stay put," Maigret told him, pocketing the button. "We're not done. If I find you've held back, I'll haul you in myself." Back at the Quai des Orfèvres, the atmosphere crackled with the buzz of a breakthrough. Etienne Moreau sat in the interrogation room, a wiry man with cold eyes and a scar across his left cheek, his dark coat slung over a chair. He exuded the quiet menace of someone who'd done violence often enough to feel at ease with it. Maigret watched him through the one-way glass for a moment, noting the lack of nerves, the steady hands. This wasn't a man rattled by arrest. Inside, Maigret took the lead, sitting across from Moreau with a deliberate slowness, letting silence build. "Pierre Fournier," he began, his voice even. "Stabbed through the heart, left in an alley off Rue des Capucines 2 nights ago.
Witnesses place you with him hours before arguing. You're known for collecting debts with a blade. Care to explain?" Moreau's lips curled into a faint sneer, his gaze unflinching. "I know plenty of people, Inspector. Doesn't mean I—"
"Kill 'em. Yeah, I saw Fournier. He owed money to a man I work for. Small sum, nothing worth a murder. I pressed him, sure, told him to pay up or face trouble. He got mouthy, walked off. That's it. Last I saw him alive. You've got nothing."
"Solid on me."
Maigret leaned back, his pipe unlit between his teeth, sensing the rehearsed edge in Moreau's words. The story aligned with Gerard's account, but it was too clean, too devoid of cracks. "Nothing solid," he echoed, "except a witness who saw fear in Fournier's eyes, and your reputation for making fear stick. Where were you between midnight and 2 when he died?" "Home, asleep," Moreau replied smoothly. "Alone. No one to vouch, but no one to contradict either. Find me a weapon, find me blood, then talk. Until then, I'm just a man who had words with a fool." Within hours, the higher-ups at the quay were ready to close the case. Moreau's history, the witness account from Gerard, the timing, it painted a picture of a debt gone sour, ended with a stiletto. The prefect himself called Maigret in, urging a swift resolution. "We've got our man, Jules," he said, slapping the file on his desk. "Enforcer with motive, opportunity, no alibi. Press charges, wrap it up. The press is already sniffing. For a tidy story." Maigret nodded, his face a mask of compliance, but unease coiled in his gut. Something didn't sit right. Moreau was a plausible culprit, a blunt instrument for someone's grudge, but the murder's orchestration, the raincoat flung open, the crypt key, the note with Montparnasse felt too theatrical for a mere debt collection. Moreau's calm, His lack of surprise at being caught suggested he expected this, perhaps welcomed it as a distraction. And Leclerc's reaction to the button, his convenient find of the key, hinted at threads still untied. As the precinct buzzed with premature triumph, Maigret returned to his desk, staring at the sketch of Moreau.
A false victory, he thought. The real criminal lurking beyond this arrest. Whoever had crafted Fournier's death wanted the police to stop here, to pin it on a thug and call it done. But Maigret saw the shadow behind the shadow. Someone with
a deeper motive, using Moreau as a pawn, waiting for the dust to settle before striking again. He'd play along for now, let the authorities crow, but his hunt wasn't over. The man in the raincoat deserved more than a scapegoat, and Maigret intended to find the hand that truly wielded the blade. The clamour of celebration at the Quai des Orfèvres faded into a distant hum as Maigret sat at his desk, the late afternoon light filtering through the window in pale streaks. The precinct was abuzz with the arrest of Etienne Moreau, the dark-coated enforcer pegged as Pierre Fournier's killer. Files were being stamped, reports finalized, and the prefect had already drafted a statement for the press about swift justice. Yet Maigret's unease gnawed at him, a quiet itch beneath the surface of this too neat resolution. Moreau fit the frame, motive through debt, opportunity through proximity, a reputation for violence. But the murder's artistry, the deliberate staging of the raincoat, the crypt's cryptic clues, all whispered of a mind sharper than a hired thug's. Someone else was orchestrating this, using Moreau as a shield, lurking in the shadows while the police tied their tidy bow. Maigret's fingers traced the edge of the folded letters from the Montparnasse crypt, their yellowed pages resting among the clutter of his desk. He'd read them a dozen times already, their vague threats. The debt must be paid, and they'll find us if we stay, echoing in his mind. They were dated over a decade ago, unsigned, offering no names to anchor their menace. But something in their tone, a desperate urgency, tugged at a memory he couldn't quite place. He pushed aside the precinct's premature triumph and turned his focus inward, sifting through years of cases, of forgotten crimes buried in the archives of his mind and the dusty filing cabinets downstairs. Lighting his pipe, he exhaled a slow plume of smoke, letting his thoughts drift. A debt unpaid, a past grudge, a staged death. Fournier's murder wasn't born of the moment, it bore the weight of history. Maigret rose, his decision made, and descended to the basement records.
Room, a dimly lit warren of shelves and mouldering boxes.
The clerk on duty, a bored young man with ink-stained fingers, barely glanced up as Maigret requested files from 10 to 15 years back, cases involving debts, disappearances, or unresolved vendettas near Montparnasse. If the crypt held secrets, they might not be Fournier's alone. Hours passed as he pored over brittle reports, the dust tickling his nose, the pipe going cold in his hand. Most were mundane, petty thefts, bar brawls, suicides, but one file dated 12 years prior halted him, a case labelled the Montparnasse disappearance. Detailed the vanishing of a man named Julien Bisset, a minor bookkeeper with ties to a local gambling ring. Bisset had owed substantial sums to unsavoury creditors, and whispers of foul play circled his absence, though no body was ever found. What caught Maigret's eye was a note in the margin, scrawled by the original investigator. A witness mentioned Bisset hiding papers of importance in a crypt near the cemetery, fearing for his life. The lead had gone cold, dismissed as hearsay, and the case was shelved as unsolved. Maigret's pulse quickened. A crypt, debts, hidden papers, it mirrored Fournier's clues too closely to be coincidence. Bissey's disappearance carried the same scent of old grudges as the letters Maigret held now. Were they Bissey's own words, stashed away for safekeeping, until Fournier stumbled into the same deadly web? He jotted down the names linked to Bissey's case, creditors, associates, anyone who might still carry the torch of that old debt. One name stood out: René Garnier, a known fixer in the gambling underworld back then, now faded into obscurity, but rumoured to still pull strings from the shadows. Garnier had been questioned, but released for lack of evidence in Bissey's vanishing. The connection felt tenuous, a thread stretched across years, but Maigret's instinct hummed. Fournier's murder wasn't just a present crime, it was a reckoning for something buried in Montparnasse's past. He returned to his desk, pulling the pawn-shop ledger notes and witness statements alongside the old file. Victor Leclerc, the scavenger, had found the crypt key near Montparnasse, perhaps not by chance, but because he frequented places tied to forgotten crimes, scavenging relics of men like Bissey. Etienne Moreau, the enforcer, might be a modern echo of Garnier's.
Muscle hired to silence Fournier as Bissey had been silenced.
And Gérard, the landlord, with his fear-soaked lies, might have known Fournier's connection to that past, paid to ignore whispers of old ghosts. Maigret's gaze shifted to the brass button, still in his pocket, a silent witness from the crypt. Its presence there, alongside the letters, suggested someone else had revisited that hidden place, someone tied to Bissey's era, or to Fournier's uncovering of it. He sent Lucas to track down any living associates of René Garnier, while he himself headed back to Belleville to confront Gérard again. The landlord's unease hinted at knowledge beyond a mere bribe. Perhaps he'd seen more than just Moreau lurking near Fournier. The evening streets were slick with drizzle as Maigret reached the rooming house, the air heavy with the scent of coal smoke and damp stone. Gérard was in the hallway, mopping a faded patch of floor, his face souring at the sight of Maigret. "Not you again?" he grumbled, gripping the mop handle like a barrier. "I've said all I'm saying. Moreau's your man, isn't he? Leave me be." Maigret stepped closer, his bulk filling the narrow space, his voice quiet but unyielding. "Moreau's a piece, not the whole. I'm looking at a bigger picture now, Monsieur Gérard. A name from years back, Julien Bissey. Disappeared near Montparnasse, owed debts to dangerous men. Fournier carried a key to the same crypt tied to Bissey's last days. Did Fournier ever mention an old case, old enemies? Or did you hear whispers yourself, living in these parts so long?" Gérard's eyes widened, a flicker of genuine shock breaking through his defensiveness before he masked it. "Bissey? Never heard of him. I don't dig into tenants' pasts, Inspector. Fournier was a nobody, like I told you. If he poked into old graves, that's his funeral. Literally. I've got nothing for you on ancient history." But the shock had been real, and Maigret caught the tremor in Gérard's voice, the way his gaze darted upstairs as if expecting a ghost to descend. "Ancient history has a way of bleeding into now," Maigret said, his tone steady. "If you knew Bissey's name, or Fournier's link to it, silence won't save you when the past catches."
Up. Think on that.
He left Gérard pale and sweating, stepping back into the misty evening with a clearer sense of the web weaving together. Bissey's disappearance linked to Fournier's death through the crypt, through debts unpaid across a decade. But the hidden connection between suspects was crystallizing now. Moreau as the modern enforcer mirroring Garnier's old role, Leclerc scavenging relics of that forgotten crime, perhaps unknowingly, Gérard trembling under the weight of names he shouldn't know. And somewhere, Maigret sensed, René Garnier or his shadow lingered. a spider at the center of a net, spun years ago. As he walked toward a nearby cafe to gather his thoughts over a coffee, Maigret felt the past pressing closer, its shadows stretching into the present. Fournier's raincoat, opened like a taunt, wasn't just a murder scene, it was a grave, marker for a debt Bisset hadn't paid, a warning to anyone who dug too deep. Maigret knew now he wasn't just chasing a killer, he was unearthing a buried sin, one that connected every suspect in ways they'd hidden until this moment. The real criminal, the mind behind the blade, wasn't in custody with Moreau. They were out there, watching, tied to a history Maigret was only beginning to unravel, and he'd need to tread carefully to avoid becoming the next name etched into Montparnasse's silent stones. The café near Gérard's rooming house was a dim, smoky refuge from the persistent mist outside, its cracked windows fogged with condensation. Maigret settled at a small table in the corner, the bitter aroma of his coffee blending with the lingering scent of tobacco as he turned over the threads of the case in his mind. The shadow of Julien Bisset's disappearance 12 years ago loomed over Pierre Fournier's murder, linking the crypt, the old debts, and a web of suspects, Etienne Moreau, Victor Leclerc, Gérard, and the unseen presence of René Garnier, the fixer from a bygone era. Maigret knew the truth lay not just in evidence, but in the silences, the hesitations, the cracks in carefully constructed facades. He needed a way to pry those cracks wider, to unsettle the players hiding behind their lies. Sipping his coffee, he considered his approach. Traditional interrogation had yielded half-truths at best: Gérard's fear, Leclerc's convenient ignorance, Moreau's cold defiance. Even the breakthrough of Bisset's old case hadn't shaken loose a confession. Maigret needed something
unconventional, a tactic to bypass their defenses and expose what they thought safely buried.
His gaze drifted to the raincoat fabric scrap in his pocket, a fragment of Fournier's final garb, and an idea formed, a psychological lever, subtle but sharp, to test the nerves of those closest to the crime. He started with Gérard, the landlord, whose raw unease hinted at knowledge too heavy to bear. Maigret returned to the rooming house as evening deepened, the streets slick with drizzle, the gaslights casting long, wavering shadows. Gérard was in the cramped hallway, sorting through a pile of tenant mail with jerky movements, his face tightening at Maigret's approach. "I've nothing left to say, Inspector," he muttered before Maigret could speak, his voice brittle. "You've got your man in custody. Leave me out of it." Maigret didn't reply immediately. Instead, he pulled the fabric scrap from his pocket, holding it up just out of Gérard's reach, letting the drab material catch the weak light. "This was Fournier's," he said, his tone conversational, almost casual. "Part of the raincoat. He died in. Found it here, among your clutter, though I suspect it wasn't just lying around by chance. I wonder, Gérard, if you've kept other pieces of him, memories, secrets, maybe something you handled for someone else. Care to hold it?"
"Might jog your memory." Gérard froze, his eyes locked on the fabric, a sheen of sweat beading on his brow despite the chilly air.
His hand twitched, as if to reach for it, then recoiled, fingers curling into a fist. "I don't want that," he snapped, too quickly, his voice cracking at the edges. "It's nothing to me. Garbage, like I said. Why parade it around like—"
It's like it's cursed or something?" Maigret noted the reaction, visceral, unguarded, a flash of dread far beyond a landlord's irritation over a tenant's mess.
He lowered the fabric, but kept it in view, watching Gérard's gaze dart to it and away, as if it burned. "Cursed," Maigret echoed softly, tilting his head. "Interesting word. Fournier's death weighs on you more than it should, doesn't it?" Not just a bribe to stay quiet about Moreau. You've touched something darker. Bissey's name struck a nerve earlier. Holding this might remind you why. Last chance to unburden yourself before I dig deeper. Gerard's face paled further, his knuckles whitening on the stack of letters he clutched. I don't know any Bissey, and I don't know what Fournier got into, he stammered, but his voice wavered, betraying a crack in his armour. That
Cloth. I might have seen it, all right? Not just lying around. Someone dropped it off weeks ago before Fournier died. Told me to keep it quiet, said it was part of a debt being settled. I didn't ask questions, couldn't afford to, that's the all. I swear it. Maigret's pulse quickened, though his expression remained impassive.
a subtle victory Gerard had slipped, admitting to a middleman role, a transaction tied to Fournier's fate long before the murder. The fabric wasn't just a relic, it was a token, a warning, perhaps even a marker of loyalty or silence. Who dropped it off? Maigret pressed, his voice still calm, the fabric now a silent weapon between them. Moreau? Someone older, with ties to Montparnasse's past? Gerard shook his head, his breath shallow, eyes darting to the stairs again, as if expecting a spectre. I didn't get a name. Dark coat, hat low, could have been your man in custody, could have been anyone. Paid me 10 francs to hold the rag, said I'd get more to forget I ever saw it.
I needed the money. That's the truth, Inspector. I'm no killer, no schemer, just caught in the middle. Caught in the middle, Maigret thought, but close enough to the fire to feel its heat. Gerard's crack, his admission of handling the
fabric as part of a deal, linked him to the broader conspiracy, to the shadow of Bissey's unresolved debt. Maigret pocketed the scrap, tipping his hat with a nod. Middle or not, Gerard, you're in it now. If that memory sharpens, name?
Face anything, find me. Waiting might cost you more than 10 francs.
Leaving the rooming house, Maigret felt the weight of that small revelation settle into place. The fabric wasn't accidental, it was deliberate, a piece of Fournier's doom, circulated before his death, binding Gerard into the silence of a larger plan. His unconventional ploy, using the cloth as a psychological trigger, had worked, peeling back a layer of Gerard's deception. But it wasn't enough. The dark-coated figure Gerard described mirrored Moreau, yet Maigret suspected a deeper player, someone tied to René Garnier's old network, orchestrating from the past's shadow. His next move turned to Victor Leclerc, the scavenger whose convenient finds, the crypt key, the buttons, smelled of more than chance. Maigret tracked him down by late evening near the canal in a shabby tavern not far from the earlier bar. Leclerc was hunched over a pint, his weathered face twitching with unease as Maigret slid into the seat across from him. Back so soon.
Inspector? He rasped, forcing a smirk that didn't reach his eyes. I've got no more junk to sell you. Maigret didn't smile. Instead, he pulled out the brass button, placing it on the scarred table between them, letting it glint in
the tavern's dim light. You sold something like this to Dubois, he said, his tone measured, almost curious. Found this one in the crypt at Montparnasse near old letters about unpaid debts. I'm not accusing you of planting it, Leclerc, but I wonder if you've picked up more than trinkets from that cemetery. Stories, maybe. Whispers of men like Julien Bissey, who vanished owing money 12 years ago. Touch it, see if it feels familiar. Might remind you of a face, a deal, something you've buried. Leclerc stared at the button, his smirk fading, replaced by a flicker of something raw. Fear, or perhaps shame. He reached out, hesitated, then drew his hand back as if stung, rubbing his fingers against his coat. I don't know any Bissey, he muttered, his voice low, unsteady. I pick up what's lying around like I told you. Buttons, keys, rubbish. But that place, Montparnasse, it's got bad air. People talk sometimes when I'm scavenging. Old debts, old blood. I heard a name once, years back, near the crypts. Garnier. Some big shadow from way before. Never saw him, just heard he don't let go of what's owed. That's all I've got, Inspector. I swear, Maigret's eyes narrowed, catching the name René. Garnier slipping from Leclerc's lips unprompted, a crack wider than Gérard's. The button, like the fabric, had unnerved him, not as evidence, but as a totem of a past he'd grazed too closely. Leclerc wasn't the mastermind, but he'd scavenged amid the ruins of Bissey's fallout, hearing whispers of Garnier's lingering grip. Maigret pocketed the button, leaning back. Garnier's name carries weight, Leclerc. If you've heard more, or seen him, now's the time. Bad air gets worse when you breathe it too long. Leclerc shook his head, his hands trembling now around his pint, but Maigret had what he needed for the moment, his unconventional tactic, using relics, as psychological prompts, had rattled two men, exposing their proximity to a shared history. Gérard's fabric, Leclerc's button, both tied to Montparnasse's ghosts, to Bissey and Garnier, confirmed the past's hold on Fournier's murder. The real criminal, Maigret knew, wasn't just a blade like Moreau. It was a mind rooted
in that old debt, now stirring to protect its secrets. As he left the tavern, the mist curling around him, he felt the case shifting beneath his feet, the cracks widening, and Garnier's shadow growing sharper, closer, a predator waiting for Maigret to overstep.
The mist hung heavy over Paris as Maigret left the tavern near the Canal Saint-Martin. The echo of Victor Leclerc's trembling confession, René Garnier's name whispered like a curse, lingering in his mind. The night air bit at his skin, sharp with the promise of colder days, but his focus burned hotter than ever. The unconventional tactic of wielding relics like psychological weapons had worked, cracking open Gérard's and Leclerc's defences, exposing their ties to a past shadowed by Julien Bissey's disappearance and Garnier's enduring grip. The threads of Pierre Fournier's murder wove tighter now, a tapestry of old debts and buried sins, with Garnier as the likely spider at its centre. Maigret felt the case gaining momentum, the truth inching closer, yet with it came a creeping certainty. Whoever orchestrated this was watching, waiting to counter his every move. He returned to the Quai des Orfèvres under a sky bruised with impending rain, his overcoat damp against his shoulders. The precinct was quieter now, the earlier fervour over Etienne Moreau's arrest dulled to routine paperwork and late-night shifts. Maigret headed straight to his desk, intent on cataloguing the day's revelations and cross-referencing Garnier's name with old records. The letters from the Montparnasse crypt, the brass button, the fabric scrap from Fournier's raincoat, they were his anchors, tangible links to the past that underpins the present crime. He unlocked the drawer where he'd secured them, a habit, born of caution in a place where files sometimes wandered and reached for the small evidence bundle. His hand froze mid-air. The drawer was lighter than it should have been. The bundle, wrapped in a plain cloth to keep the items together, was gone. Only a stray paperclip and a stray scrap of unrelated notes remained, mocking the empty space. Maigret's jaw tightened, a slow burn of anger mixing with sharp alarm. He rifled through the drawer, then checked neighbouring ones, though he knew it was futile. The evidence hadn't been misplaced, it had been taken. The letters with their cryptic threats, the button from the crypt, the fabric tied to Gérard's slip, crucial pieces of the puzzle, stolen from under his nose in the heart of the police. Headquarters! He straightened, his pipe unlit between his teeth, and scanned the dimly lit office. A few officers milled about, typing reports or murmuring over coffee, none paying him heed. Yet the violation felt personal, deliberate, a silent declaration of war from someone who knew exactly what those items signified. Maigret's mind raced through possibilities. A mole within the quay? Unlikely, but not impossible. Corruption wasn't new, and Garnier's reach might extend to a desperate clerk or disillusioned sergeant. More probable was a break-in, subtle and swift, by someone with access or knowledge of the precinct's rhythms. The timing was too precise, coming just as he'd rattled Gérard and Leclerc as Garnier's shadow loomed larger. Maigret summoned Sergeant Lucas, who'd been logging witness statements across the hall, and kept his voice low, masking the urgency beneath a veneer of calm. "Lucas, my desk drawer's been compromised."
Evidence from the Fournier case, letters, a button, a fabric scrap, gone. When did you last see activity near my space? Anyone out of place, lingering without cause? Lucas's eyebrows shot up, his face paling slightly as he processed the
breach. "I've been in and out, Inspector, but I didn't notice anything off. Couple of uniforms came through an hour ago, dropping off reports, and the night clerk's been at the front desk. No strangers, though. I can check the log, see who's been in the building past shift changes. You think it's tied to the case?" "I don't think I know," Maigret replied, his tone clipped. "Someone's burying the truth before we dig too deep. Double-check the logs quietly. No alarms yet. I don't want whoever did this to know we're rattled. And set a watch on my desk from now on. If they come back, I want them caught." As Lucas hurried off, Maigret sat heavily in his chair, the loss of the evidence a bitter weight. Those items weren't just objects. They were pressure points, tools that had already forced confessions and could force more. Their theft meant someone feared their power, someone close enough to act with precision. Trust, already thin in this web of deception, fractured further. He couldn't be sure who in the quay might be compromised, or if an outsider had slipped through under a
false pretext.
The stakes had risen sharply. Without the physical clues, his case rested on memory, notes, and the fragility of rattled witnesses. He pulled out his notebook, reconstructing what he could from the stolen items. The letters' phrases. "The debt must be paid," were burned into his mind, their dates and tone clear enough to reference. The button's description, the fabric's shade, all were logged in prior reports to Lucas and the morgue team. But the tangible proof, the weight that could sway a court or unnerve a suspect, was gone. Maigret's irritation flared, though he channeled it into focus. If the thief meant to derail him, they'd miscalculated. The absence of evidence only sharpened his resolve, turning the hunt personal. His thoughts turned to protection of what remained. The key found on Fournier, the one that opened the crypt, was still in evidence lockup downstairs, under stricter security. He'd check it personally, ensure no further tampering, and request a duplicate for safekeeping. But first, he needed to trace the breach. He cornered the night clerk, a nervous young man named Pichot, whose hands fidgeted as Maigret questioned him about visitors or odd activity. "No one unusual, sir," Pichot stammered, avoiding eye contact. "Just the usual officers, a courier with some files around 8. Didn't linger, signed in and out per protocol." A courier, Maigret's instinct pricked. "Description," he demanded, leaning closer. "And check that sign-in sheet, now." Pichot scrambled for the log, his voice shaky as he read off the name, Jacques Dupont, delivery for precinct records, and described a nondescript man in a grey cap, average height, unremarkable. Too unremarkable, Maigret thought. A false name, likely, and a forged purpose. The timing aligned with his absence during the confrontation with Leclerc. Someone had planned this, knowing his habits, exploiting the Quai's routine. The rain began, again pattering against the window as Maigret processed the betrayal. René Garnier's influence, or that of his proxy, seemed the likely force behind this. The theft wasn't just sabotage, it was a message: stop digging or lose more than evidence. But Maigret wasn't one to heed warnings. He sent Lucas to track any trace of the courier, however thin, and began reconstructing his strategy. Gérard and Leclerc's cracks remained, etched in memory, if not in stolen cloth. Moreau, still in custody, might yield under renewed pressure if Maigret hinted at deeper players. And Garnier, whether alive or a ghost through his network, needed to be found, his shadow confronted. As midnight neared, Maigret stood by the window, watching rivulets of rain trace paths down the glass. The vanishing evidence had heightened, the stakes turning allies into potential threats, silence into a weapon. Trust was a fragile thing now, shattered by unseen hands, but Maigret's resolve hardened. Whoever sought to bury the truth had underestimated him. Fournier's murder, Bissey's disappearance, the crypt's secrets, they wouldn't stay hidden. He'd rebuild his case brick by stolen brick, and when he found the thief, they'd lead him straight to the heart of this darkness. The Raincoats. Riddle still awaited its answer, and Maigret would chase it, even if every clue slipped through his fingers like the rain itself. The rain drummed a steady rhythm against the window of Maigret's office at the Quai des Orfèvres, the late hour, casting long shadows across his cluttered desk. The theft of crucial evidence, the crypt letters, the brass button, the fabric scrap from Fournier's raincoat, still stung, a calculated blow that had fractured his trust in the precinct's security and heightened the stakes of Pierre Fournier's murder. Maigret's resolve, however, burned brighter for it. The vanished clues were a challenge, a taunt from an unseen hand, likely tied to René Garnier or his lingering network, intent on burying the past before it could be unearthed. As he sat reconstructing his case from memory and sparse notes, the weight of the investigation pressed down, a puzzle with pieces slipping through his grasp like the rain outside. But he knew he couldn't falter. Every stolen item confirmed he was closing in, even if the enemy moved unseen. It was past 1 in the morning when Sergeant Lucas burst into the office, his face pale under the brim of his cap, raindrops glistening on his coat. "Inspector, we've got trouble," he said, his voice tight with urgency. "It's Gérard, the landlord from Belleville. Found dead in his rooming house not half an hour ago. Single stab wound to the chest, clean, just like. Fournier, neighbor, heard a scuffle, called it in, scene's fresh but no witnesses yet. I've got men securing it, but you'll want to see this yourself." Maigret's blood ran cold, though his face betrayed nothing as he rose, pulling on his overcoat with deliberate calm. Gérard, the nervous landlord whose cracks Maigret had widened with the fabric scrap, whose fear hinted at deeper knowledge of Fournier's doom and the shadow of Julien Bissey's past, dead in the same precise manner. This wasn't coincidence. It was a message, a ruthless silencing of a loose end. The villain, whoever they were, remained several steps ahead, striking while Maigret chased stolen evidence and old ghosts. The investigation had taken a sharp, brutal turn, and now it wasn't just about solving Fournier's murder, it was about preventing the next death in a chain that clearly hadn't ended. The ride to Belleville was tense, the rain-slicked streets reflecting the flash of passing gaslights as Maigret processed the implications. Gérard's death mirrored Fournier's too closely. Single stab, no struggle, a clinical efficiency that screamed intent. Whoever wielded the blade, whether Etienne Moreau or another under orders, operated with impunity, knowing Maigret's case had been hobbled by the evidence theft. The timing suggested desperation or confidence, a move to bury secrets Gérard might have spilled under further pressure. Maigret's gut twisted with the realization that his psychological probe, the fabric trick, might have painted a target on the landlord's back. But guilt was a luxury he couldn't afford now. He had to act, to outpace a killer who struck with surgical precision. The rooming house loomed under the drizzle, its sagging facade now a crime scene, cordoned off by uniformed officers, their lanterns casting eerie pools of light. Neighbors hovered at the edges, murmuring behind hands, their faces pale with shock or curiosity. Maigret stepped through the narrow hallway, the familiar mildew scent now undercut by the metallic tang of blood. Gérard lay sprawled near the staircase, face up, his eyes wide and unseeing, a single wound in his chest staining his worn shirt crimson. No mess, no footprints in the dust, just like Fournier, a staged kill, though less public, hidden within walls that had already whispered too much. Same method, Lucas confirmed, hovering at Maigret's shoulder with a notebook. Blade went straight through, likely a stiletto, no defensive marks. Neighbor heard a brief shout around midnight, then silence. Door was unlocked, no sign of forced entry. Killer might have known him, or he let them in. We're canvassing, but with this rain, any traces outside are gone. Maigret nodded, crouching beside the body, his gaze tracing the scene. Gérard's hands were empty, no weapon or note, but a faint glint near his collar caught his eye. A loose thread, drab and familiar, matching the raincoat fabric he'd used to unsettle the man just hours ago. A taunt, perhaps, or a careless trace left by the killer. Maigret pocketed it with a gloved hand, his mind racing. The fabric's presence tied this death to Fournier's, confirming a single mind behind both, and likely behind the evidence theft. Someone was tying up loose ends with ruthless efficiency, and Gérard, who'd admitted to handling that fabric for a shadowy figure, had outlived his silence. Straightening, Maigret felt the weight of the new crime settle on him. The investigation had escalated. He wasn't just chasing a murderer now, but racing against a predator intent on erasing every link to the past. René Garnier's name, whispered by Leclerc, loomed larger. A fixer from Bissey's era wouldn't hesitate to silence a pawn like Gérard if his network still thrived. And Victor Leclerc, another rattled witness, might be next, or even Maigret himself if he dug too deep. Trust, thinned by the evidence breach, fractured further. He couldn't be sure who at the Quai might leak his moves, wittingly or not. Secure. The scene tight, Maigret instructed Lucas, his voice low but firm. No word of this pattern to the press or outside teams yet. We've got a repeat killer, and I don't want them spooked into hiding or striking faster. And get a man on Leclerc, discreetly. He's shaky, knows Garnier's name, and I don't want him joining Gérard before I squeeze more out of him. Lucas nodded, jotting notes, but Maigret's mind was already pivoting. Gérard's death proved the villain's reach, inside the Quai for the theft, now into Belleville for murder. The precision suggested planning, access, and a cold certainty that Maigret's hobbled case wouldn't catch up in time. But it also betrayed urgency. Gérard hadn't been a random target, but a threat, someone who'd seen or handled too much. Maigret recalled the landlord's fear, his darting glances, the unnamed dark-coated figure who'd paid for silence. Was it Moreau, released on lack of solid evidence after Fournier's murder, or another proxy for Garnier's will? Back at the quay by the early hours, Maigret sat at his desk, the rain a relentless murmur outside. He sketched a timeline, Fournier's
murder 3 nights ago, the evidence theft last night, Gérard's death mere hours past. The pace was accelerating, the killer, or their mastermind, acting to bury the Bisset-era secrets before Maigret unearthed them fully. He sent a request
via Lucas to pull Moreau back in for questioning, even if on flimsy grounds. The enforcer's calm in custody suggested he knew more or expected protection. Simultaneously, he dispatched a trusted officer to trace any living trace of Garnier, however faint, old haunts, known associates, anything to pinpoint the spider, at the web's heart. As dawn crept grey over Paris, Maigret lit his pipe, the smoke curling like his thoughts. The unexpected twist of Gérard's murder had sharpened the hunt, proving the enemy's lead and their willingness to kill again. He wasn't just solving a crime now, he was in a lethal chess game, protecting potential targets, Leclerc perhaps, others tied to the crypt's past, while closing in on a killer who struck from shadows. The Raincoat's riddle, once a cold case of staged death, was now a race against bloodshed. Maigret felt the villain's gaze, unseen but palpable, daring him to make the next move. And he would, even if every step risked another body, or his own. The past wouldn't stay buried, not while he drew breath to dig. The first light of dawn crept through the grimy windows of the Quai des Orfèvres, casting a pallid glow over Maigret's desk as he sat, pipe-cold between his teeth, staring at the sparse notes scrawled in his notebook. Gérard's murder, mere hours ago, had jolted the investigation into a desperate new phase, a second death mirroring Pierre Fournier's with chilling precision. A single, clean stab wound, no struggle, a message of ruthless efficiency. The theft of crucial evidence from his drawer, followed by this latest killing, confirmed a predator several steps ahead, intent on erasing every trace of a past tied to Julien Bisset's disappearance and René Garnier's shadowy influence. Maigret felt the weight of a race against time, not just to solve the crimes, but to prevent another body from falling. Yet, amid the chaos, the breached trust, the accelerating bloodshed, his mind churned, seeking order, a thread to grasp in the tangled web. He exhaled a slow breath, the memory of Gérard's crime scene vivid, the landlord's lifeless stare, the drab thread near his collar echoing Fournier's raincoat, the unlocked door suggesting familiarity or coercion. Lucas had men guarding Victor Leclerc, the scavenger who'd whispered Garnier's name, and others tracking Etienne Moreau for re-questioning, while a search for Garnier's lingering presence continued. But Maigret knew brute pursuit wouldn't outpace this enemy. He needed clarity, a pattern to anchor the swirl of deception, theft, and murder. His gaze drifted to the timeline he'd sketched. Fournier's death, the evidence theft, Gérard's silencing, each act a calculated strike. There had to be a rhythm, a signature he'd overlooked, hidden in plain sight. Rising, he paced to the window, the rain now a faint drizzle, Paris stirring awake beyond the glass. His thoughts circled back to the beginning, to Fournier's body. In the alley off Rue des Capucines, the raincoat flung open like a taunt, exposing the wound for the world to see. That detail had struck him from the first, a staged display, not just a kill, but a declaration. Gérard's death, though less public, carried a similar intent. The body, left face up, wound uncovered, the thread of fabric as a subtle marker. Both scenes screamed purpose, a message woven into the violence. But what message? A warning to others? A challenge to Maigret? Or something older, tied to Bissey's vanished years? He returned to his desk, flipping through earlier reports, his mind sifting for the insignificant, the overlooked. Witness statements blurred together, Dubois' guarded reticence, Madame Claire's account of the dark-coated watcher, Leclerc's nervous scavenging tales, until a passing remark from Madame Claire, buried in Lucas's initial notes, halted him. She'd mentioned Fournier's habit in the café, a small tic. He always folded his napkin into a tight square after sipping his wine, tucking it beside his glass like a ritual before leaving. She'd thought it odd, a fussy gesture for a down-and-out man, but dismissed it as irrelevant. Maigret paused, pencil hovering over the page. A folded square, precise, deliberate, a tiny act of order in a disordered life. The image nagged at him, a spark amid the chaos. He cross-referenced it against Gérard's scene in his memory. The landlord's hallway table, cluttered with unopened mail when Maigret last confronted him, had a single envelope near the top, its corner folded sharply as if pressed with intent, not just creased by accident. He hadn't noted it then, too focused on Gérard's crumbling facade, but now it echoed Fournier's napkin, a small, meticulous act, out of place in a slovenly setting. 2 deaths, 2 staged bodies, and now 2 instances of deliberate folding, a quirk, shared or imposed. Was it coincidence, or a signature, a compulsion leaking from the killer's mind into their victims' worlds? Maigret's pulse quickened, though his face remained impassive. He lit his pipe, the smoke curling as his thoughts aligned. The folding, napkin, envelope was too precise, too peculiar to be random. It suggested control, a need to impose order. On chaos mirroring the murder's clinical neatness, Fournier's raincoat opened just so, Gérard's body positioned with care. No mess, no excess, everything arranged. The killer wasn't just silencing, they were curating, leaving their mark in subtleties Maigret had nearly missed. This wasn't Garnier's blunt fixer style from the old files, nor Moreau's thuggish menace. It was personal, obsessive, a mind shaped by years of harboring a debt or grudge, manifesting in these small, ritualistic acts. He leaned back, the pattern emerging clearer now. The key to the case wasn't just the crypt or Bissey's past. It was this behavioral tell, a psychological fingerprint hidden in plain sight all along. The folding tied the scenes, suggesting the killer had been close to both victims, close, enough to influence or mimic their habits, or to imprint their own. Fournier, a haunted loner, might have adopted it under pressure from whoever stalked him, as Madame Claire's watcher loomed. Gérard, paid to hold the fabric scrap, might have been instructed to fold that envelope as a sign of compliance, a coded acknowledgement of his silence. Or the killer themselves, unable to resist, had left the mark post-mortem, a subconscious signature. Maigret's mind raced to test this. If the folding was the killer's habit, it might appear elsewhere, on Moreau if he was more than a pawn, or in traces tied to Garnier's old network. He sent Lucas a note to recheck Fournier's scant belongings at the morgue for any folded items, and to subtly observe Moreau in custody for similar tics. Meanwhile, he needed to revisit the crypt, the heart of this history, to search for any overlooked detail, a folded paper, a carved mark, that might bear the same obsessive trace. The pattern gave him a lens, a way to sift suspects beyond their alibis or lies. By mid-morning, with the rain easing into a grey haze, Maigret stood at the Montparnasse cemetery gate, the crypt's iron bars looming under a drizzle-soaked sky. The key, still secure in evidence lock-up after the theft scare, had been duplicated under his watch. He carried it now, unlocking the gate with a soft clang. Descending the narrow stair, the damp air clung to him, the memory of the stolen letters, vivid but their absence irrelevant to this hunt. He scanned the chamber, lantern in hand, past the trunk where he'd found the evidence, past the rubble, until his light caught a faint scratch on the far wall near the floor, a small, precise square etched into the stone, its edges too neat for erosion or chance. His breath caught, the pattern snapping into focus. A square, like the folded napkin, the envelope corner, a marker, old and weathered, likely from Bisset's era or shortly after, carved by someone with the same need for order. It tied the crypt to the murders, not just through debts, but through a mind that hadn't let go in 12 years. The killer or their mentor had been here, leaving their obsession etched into history, a compulsion that bled into Fournier's and Gérard's deaths. Maigret straightened, the lantern's glow flickering as he absorbed the revelation. Amid the chaos, the theft, the second murder, a pattern had emerged, a seemingly insignificant quirk, now the key he'd sought. The folding, the squares, they were the villain's shadow, in plain sight from the start, a thread to pull that might unravel Garnier's legacy or reveal a disciple closer than he'd guessed. The stakes were sharper now. He wasn't just preventing another death, but decoding a mind that killed with ritual precision. As he climbed back into the grey daylight, securing the crypt behind him, Maigret knew the pattern would lead him to the killer if he could follow it before their next ordered strike. The grey daylight over Montparnasse Cemetery felt heavier. As Maigret emerged from the crypt, the iron gate clanging shut behind him with a hollow echo. The etched square on the stone wall, a precise, deliberate mark mirroring the folded napkin of Pierre Fournier and the creased envelope near Gérard's body, burned in his mind, a silent signature of obsession that tied the murders to a past, rooted in Julien Bisset's disappearance. This pattern, a compulsion for order hidden in plain sight, had crystallized the hunt, giving Maigret a lens to see the killer's mind through their ritualistic traces. Yet, even as the drizzle dampened his overcoat and the chill of the morning seeped into his bones, he felt the weight of unanswered questions. The pattern identified a psychological quirk, but not the why, the driving force behind such meticulous violence spanning over a decade. The true motive, he sensed, lay deeper, beyond the surface debts and grudges tied to Bisset and René Garnier's old network. Back at the Quai des Orfèvres by late morning, Maigret sat at his desk, the precinct's a distant backdrop to his focus. The stolen evidence still rankled, but the pattern of folded squares gave him a tether to rebuild his case. Sergeant Lucas had returned with findings from the morgue. Among Fournier's meagre possessions, a scrap of paper, an old receipt, had been folded into a tight square, tucked into a pocket of his spare shirt as if placed with care. Etienne Moreau, observed in custody, showed no such tick, his demeanour still cold and unreadable, suggesting he might be a tool rather than the architect. Maigret's thoughts turned to Victor Leclerc, the scavenger under watch, and to Garnier, the ghost from Bisset's era, whose name evoked fear. But the motive, what fueled this ordered bloodshed, remained elusive, a shadow behind the shadow. He decided to confront Leclerc again, sensing the man's rattled nerves might yield more under the weight of Gérard's death and the emerging pattern. By early afternoon, Maigret found him in a run-down lodging near the canal under discreet police guard. Leclerc sat on a sagging cot, his weathered face twitching with unease as Maigret entered, closing the door with a heavy thud. "Inspector, I've told you everything," Leclerc muttered, his voice rough, eyes darting to the narrow window. "I'm no killer, I just pick up what's left behind." Maigret didn't sit, standing over him with a quiet intensity, pulling the duplicated crypt key from his pocket and placing it on the scarred table beside the cot. "You mentioned Garnier, a name from a past you shouldn't know," he said, his tone steady, almost curious. "You found this key near Montparnasse, tied to a crypt with an old mark. A carved square, precise, like something folded with care. Fournier and Gérard, both dead, had similar marks in their lives, folded papers, neat edges. It's a signature, Leclerc, not just of death, but of a mind that can't let go. What did you hear about Garnier beyond debts? What drives a man to kill with such order over years?" Leclerc's hands trembled, rubbing against his frayed coat, his gaze locked on the key, as if it might bite. I don't know his mind," he stammered, but his voice cracked, betraying more. "Years back, scavenging near the cemetery, I heard whispers. Garnier wasn't just a fixer, not just about money. They said he lost something. Someone, long ago, blamed Bisset for it. Not a debt of francs, but of life. A betrayal, deeper than business. Folks said he swore to make things right, no matter how long. That's all I heard, Inspector. Old ghost stories. I didn't think they'd come for me." Maigret's pulse quickened, though his face remained a mask. A betrayal deeper than business, a loss of life. Leclerc's words hinted at a motive beyond greed or power, something personal, visceral, a wound festering over years. He pressed gently, sensing the crack widening. "A loss, you say? A person?"
Family? A friend? What did Bisset take from Garnier that's worth killing for, 12 years on? Leclerc shook his head, shrinking back, but the fear in his eyes spoke louder than words. "I don't know details, just rumors of a child?"
Maybe. Gone because of Bisset's cowardice or betrayal. Garnier's name carried that pain, they said. He'd never forgive, never forget. That's why I steered clear of those crypts, even for scraps. Bad air, bad blood. The room seemed to tighten around Maigret as the pieces shifted into a shocking
new alignment. A child, lost, tied to Bisset's actions, a grief so profound it fueled Garnier's descent into an obsession with order, a need to control the chaos of loss through ritualistic precision.
The folded squares, the staged bodies, the clean kills, they weren't just messages. They were memorials, attempts to reclaim balance from a world turned wrong 12 years ago. Fournier, perhaps, had stumbled on this history or been complicit. In Bisset's original sin, Gérard handled tokens of that past, becoming collateral in Garnier's crusade. The motive wasn't money or revenge in the usual sense. It was a father's or a loved one's torment, a psychological scar that drove Garnier or his proxy to extremes, silencing anyone who threatened to expose or repeat the past betrayal. Maigret pocketed the key, his mind racing as he left Leclerc trembling on the cot. Back at the quay, he dug into archived records on Garnier with renewed urgency, cross-referencing personal details beyond his fixer reputation. A marriage certificate from 15 years prior surfaced, followed by a birth record, a daughter, Elise Garnier, born a year later. Then a death notice, stark and brief. Elise, age 2, deceased in an accident near Montparnasse, circumstances unclear, no charges
Filed.
The timing aligned with Bisset's gambling debts and disappearance. A year before the child's death, Bisset had been linked to a rigged game gone wrong, rumors of informing to save himself from creditors. Had Bisset's betrayal, perhaps exposing Garnier to enemies or failing to protect during a violent fallout, led to Elise's death, an indirect casualty of underworld chaos? The revelation struck Maigret like a cold wave. Garnier's psychology unfolded before him, a man shattered by grief, blaming Bisset for a loss beyond recompense, his fixer's ruthlessness morphing into a mission to erase every trace of that betrayal's ripple. The folded squares, perhaps a child's game, a memory of Elise folding paper with tiny hands, became his ritual, a compulsive attempt to order a fractured world imposed on each kill. Fournier may be a peripheral figure. In Bissey's circle, or a later discoverer of the truth, became a target when he unearthed the crypt's secrets. Gérard, handling the fabric token, tied himself to the same doomed thread. The extremes, the evidence theft, the swift murders, were born of a desperate need to protect Elise's memory from desecration, to prevent the past's ugliness from resurfacing. Maigret lit his pipe, the smoke curling as the true motive settled into place. It wasn't just shocking in its depth, a parent's unending anguish, but in its distortion, turning love into a blade that cut across years. Garnier, or someone carrying his pain, wasn't just a criminal. They were a wounded soul, trapped in a cycle of control and erasure. Yet this understanding didn't soften the hunt, it sharpened the stakes. Maigret now saw why the villain struck with such ferocity. Every death was a defense of a sacred loss, every cover-up a shield for a ghost. The crypt square, the folded traces, they were elegies, and Maigret knew he had to confront this grief-driven killer before their next act of misguided preservation claimed another life. As the afternoon waned, he prepared to track Garnier's last known ties. The villain's psyche laid bare, but their location still a shadow he must chase through Paris's unforgiving streets. The late afternoon cast long shadows over Paris as Maigret sat at his desk in the Quai des Orfèvres, the weight of the revealed motive, a grief-driven obsession rooted in René Garnier's loss of his daughter Élise, settling into his bones like the damp chill outside. The folded squares, the ritualistic precision of Pierre Fournier's and Gérard's murders, the crypt's etched mark, they were all elegies to a child lost 12 years ago, a tragedy blamed on Julien Bissey's betrayal in a brutal underworld. Fallout. Garnier's psychology, warped by unending anguish, had turned love into a lethal compulsion to control and erase any threat to that sacred memory. Maigret understood now why the killer went to such extremes, evidence stolen, witnesses silenced, to shield a past too painful to face. But understanding didn't dull his resolve, it honed it. He had to confront this shadow, to stop the cycle of violence before another life was claimed in Elise's name. With the motive clear, Maigret turned to the hunt's final phase. Garnier, or a disciple carrying his pain, was the mind behind. The blade and tracking him required precision as meticulous as the murders themselves. Old records and informant whispers had yielded a lead. Garnier, though long vanished from public view after Bissey's era, was rumoured to haunt a derelict warehouse near the Seine, a forgotten corner of the city where the underworld still murmured his name. Associates from his fixer days, now grey and cautious, had hinted at sightings, a gaunt figure, always in a dark coat, moving through the shadows of industrial decay. Maigret trusted the lead enough to act, but not blindly. He needed a trap, a lure to draw the villain out on his terms, where composure and strategy could outweigh desperation. He devised a plan with quiet deliberation, sharing it only with Sergeant Lucas and a trusted handful of officers to avoid leaks after the evidence theft. The warehouse district was a maze of crumbling brick and rusted iron, perfect for an ambush if played right. Maigret would use himself as bait, leaking word through carefully chosen channels, tavern gossips near the canal, a discreet whisper. To Victor Leclerc under guard that he'd uncovered a final piece of Bissey's legacy, a hidden journal in the Montparnasse crypt detailing Elise's death, to be retrieved that night. The bait was a fabrication, but tailored to provoke. If Garnier's obsession was to protect his daughter's memory, the threat of such exposure would force his hand. Maigret's team would stake out the crypt covertly, ready to tail anyone drawn out, while he positioned himself visibly near the cemetery, a lone figure inviting confrontation. As twilight fell, the air thick with the scent of rain-soaked stone, Maigret stood near the Montparnasse gate, his overcoat collar turned up against the damp, his pipe glowing faintly as a signal to any watcher. Hidden in the surrounding shadows, Lucas and the others waited, their presence a reassuring weight, though tension coiled tight in Maigret's chest. The city hummed distant and indifferent, the cemetery's silence broken only by the drip of water from ancient eaves. Hours ticked by, the bait seemingly ignored, until a faint scrape of boot on gravel pricked his ears near 9 o'clock.
A figure emerged from the mist, dark-coated, hat low, moving with a predator's caution toward the crypt's entrance, too deliberate to be a stray wanderer. Maigret's pulse steadied, the trap had sprung. He didn't move yet, letting the
figure, slim, older than expected with a gaunt frame, reach the gate before calling out, his voice low but carrying. "René Garnier, I presume? Looking for something I don't have, a journal about Elise, but I do have the truth. Shall we talk, or will you run from it like you've run from everything since she died?" The figure froze, shoulders tensing, then turned slowly, revealing a lined face etched with years of pain, eyes sharp despite their weariness. It was Garnier, no proxy, his presence confirming the depth of his obsession. His hand hovered near his coat pocket, likely concealing a blade, but he made no sudden move. "Inspector Maigret," he rasped, voice rough as if seldom used, "you've dug too deep into graves that aren't yours. Elise rests there. Fournier, Gérard." They threatened that rest, digging into old sins. "You'll do the same if I let you." Maigret stepped closer, hands visible, his composure a shield against the tension crackling between them. "I know about Elise, about Bissey's betrayal costing her life in that accident. I know the folded squares are your way of ordering a world that broke when she died, but killing won't bring her back, Garnier. Fournier stumbled on the crypt, on letters tied to Bissey. He
wasn't the enemy.
Gérard was just a frightened pawn. You've stolen evidence, silenced voices, but I've got the pieces now. Your pain's clear, but so is your guilt. End this here. Confess, or it ends in cuffs." Garnier's eyes narrowed, a flicker of torment crossing his face, his hand twitching toward the pocket. "Confess?" he spat, bitterness lacing the word. "To you? Justice didn't save Elise when Bissey sold us out to save his skin, when his cowardice let thugs come for me and mine. She died because I couldn't protect her, because chaos ruled. I made order after, every fold, every cut, a balance restored. You can't stop that, Inspector. Step aside or you're next." The threat hung heavy, but Maigret held his ground, his gaze unyielding, sensing the desperation beneath Garnier's resolve. He knew Lucas's team encircled them, silent but ready. Yet he wanted the confession, the closure of words over force. "Balance," he echoed softly, almost sadly. "You call murder balance? Elise wouldn't. I've seen the squares, on paper, in stone, a child's game turned to blood. You stole my evidence to hide her story, killed to bury it deeper, but it's out now. I've witnesses secured, notes beyond your reach. Your last move is here, Garnier. Speak, or lose even the memory of control." Garnier's face contorted, grief and rage warring as his hand slipped into the pocket, drawing a thin stiletto, its blade glinting in the dim light. For a moment, escape seemed his intent, a desperate lunge past Maigret toward the shadowed lanes. But Maigret's calm held, his voice cutting sharper. "You won't make it 10 steps. My men are closer than you think. Drop it, or Elise's."
Name ends in a prison cell, not a quiet grave. Last chance. The words struck like a blow. Garnier's grip faltered, the knife trembling as his shoulders slumped, the fight draining from him. "I did it for her," he whispered, voice breaking.
The blade clattering to the ground. Fournier found the letters, wanted to sell Bissey's shame, her shame, for coin. Gérard knew too much, handled what he shouldn't. I had to keep it clean, ordered, for Elise. Every square was hers, every killer shield. "Take me, Inspector. I'm done running." Maigret nodded, signaling Lucas to emerge from the shadows as he knelt to retrieve the stiletto, his movements slow, deliberate. Tension peaked and released, the confession a brittle victory against the night's chill. Garnier stood defeated, hands limp, as cuffs clicked around his wrists, his eyes distant, lost in a past Maigret could only imagine. The pieces, Bissey's betrayal, Elise's death, the ritual murders, locked into place, a tragic puzzle solved under the cemetery's silent watch. Maigret lit his pipe as Garnier was led away, the smoke curling like a sigh. The hunt ended here, composure holding through the final confrontation, but the weight of a father's broken grief lingered, a shadow no arrest could fully erase. The misty night air clung to Maigret as he watched René Garnier being led away in cuffs, the faint clink of metal echoing off the ancient stones of Montparnasse Cemetery. The gaunt figure, broken by grief over his daughter Elise's death, had confessed under the weight of Maigret's trap, a fabricated journal lure that struck at the heart of his obsession to shield her memory. Garnier's ritualistic murders of Pierre Fournier and Gérard, marked by folded squares and clinical precision, had been laid bare as acts of warped balance, a desperate attempt to order a world shattered 12 years ago by Julien Bissey, betrayal. The stiletto dropped at Maigret's feet, and the confession, raw with pain, seemed to close the case as Lucas and the team secured the scene under the drizzle-soaked shadows. Yet, even as Maigret lit his pipe, the familiar burn of tobacco couldn't fully ease the quiet itch in his gut, a sense that the puzzle, though assembled, harbored a hidden crack. Back at the Quai des Orfèvres by the early hours, the precinct buzzed with subdued triumph. Garnier sat in a holding cell, his silence now a wall after the torrent of his confession, while reports were drafted and the prefect notified of the resolution. Maigret sat at his desk, the weight of the night's confrontation lingering as he reviewed his notes. The motive, Garnier's unending anguish over Elise, fit the psychological pattern of control through ritualistic acts. The folded squares, the stolen evidence, the swift silencing of threats, all aligned with a man driven by personal loss rather than mere criminal gain. Fournier uncovering the crypt's secrets, Gérard handling tokens of that past, both became casualties of Garnier's crusade. Maigret's genius had unravelled the thread, setting the perfect trap, and yet the itch persisted, a whisper that the final piece remained unseen. It was Lucas who brought the disruption, striding into the office. Just past 3 in the morning, his face tight with unease, a thin file clutched in his hand. "Inspector, we've got a problem," he said, voice low, glancing over his shoulder as if the walls might overhear. While processing Garnier's belongings post-arrest, we found this, a letter tucked into an inner pocket of his coat. It's not old like the crypt ones. It's dated last week. And it's not to him, but from him, addressed to someone named Claudine. Mentions a final task and keeping her safe at all costs. There's gratitude in it, like he's thanking whoever Claudine is for handling something he couldn't. I thought you'd want to see this before it's logged officially." Maigret's blood chilled as he took the file, the paper crisp under his fingers, unlike the yellowed relics of Bissey's era. The handwriting matched Garnier's scrawl from older records, a looping, precise script, and the date, scribed in ink only days old, confirmed Lucas's summary. "Claudine, my thanks for bearing the weight I could not," it read in part. "The last of the taint is gone with Gerard's silence, but if Maigret digs further, you know what must be done. Keep her safe, as we swore. I trust your hand to finish what mine began." No address, no surname for Claudine, but the tone, intimate, reliant, suggested a confidant, a disciple perhaps, tied to Elise's memory as deeply as Garnier. The her was unmistakable, Elise, or her legacy, and the final task hinted at a contingency, a shadow still active even as Garnier surrendered. The revelation shook the case's foundation, just as it seemed resolved. Maigret's jaw tightened, his pipe forgotten on the desk as he absorbed the last-minute twist. Garnier wasn't the sole architect. There was a second player, Claudine, entrusted with continuing his mission if he fell. The murders, the evidence theft, Garnier had confessed to them, but this letter implied collaboration, someone else's, hand in the game, perhaps the one who'd slipped into the quay to steal the letters and fabric, covering tracks while Garnier struck. The case wasn't open and shut, it was a hydra, one head severed only to reveal another lurking in the mist. Maigret's genius faced a final test, not just to tie up loose ends, but to outwit a hidden mastermind before their final task unfolded. He kept his composure, masking the jolt of alarm as he instructed Lucas to lock the letter in evidence, under strict guard, no repeats of past breaches, and to say nothing yet to the team. "Dig into Garnier's past deeper," he added, voice steady. "Find any Claudine tied to him, family, lover, associate. Check Elise's death records for caretakers or witnesses, anyone close enough to share his vow. And keep eyes on Garnier in the cell. If he suspects we've found this, he might signal her somehow." Lucas nodded, hurrying off, while Maigret leaned back, mind racing through the implications. Claudine's identity was the crux. Was she a sister, a wife, a nanny bound to Elise by devotion, twisted into complicity by shared grief? The letter's tone suggested unwavering trust, a bond as personal as Garnier's loss, pointing to someone intimate rather than hired. Maigret recalled the efficiency of the evidence theft, too smooth for Garnier alone, an aging man of limited means suggesting a younger, stealthier ally. Claudine, then, might have been the dark-coated figure Gerard described, the courier who breached the quay, a shadow executing tasks Garnier's confession hadn't covered. If so, she was still out there, armed with his intent, poised to strike if Maigret's pursuit threatened Elise's sanctified memory further. The hour crept toward dawn, the precinct's lights casting harsh glints across his desk as Maigret sifted through Garnier's archived life once more. A faded marriage record noted a wife, Marianne, deceased a year after Elise, cause unlisted, grief, perhaps, or darker fallout. No other family surfaced, but a burial footnote for Elise mentioned. A godmother, Claudine Varet, present at the service, a name unremarked in criminal contexts but tied to Garnier's inner circle. Maigret's instinct flared. Godmother fit the protective, keep her safe phrasing. A surrogate mother vowed to guard Elise's resting peace. Cross-checking old addresses, Varet lingered in Paris, last noted in a tenement near Belleville, 2, close to Gerard's rooming house for coincidence. He acted swiftly, dispatching a discreet pair of officers to surveil the address. No contact yet, just eyes on movement. Simultaneously, he revisited Garnier in the holding cell, the man's gaunt frame slouched against the wall, eyes hollow but flickering with something unspoken as Maigret entered. "Claudine Varret," Maigret said without preamble, standing just beyond the bars, his tone flat but piercing. "Your godmother to Elise, your trusted hand. The letter in your coat tells me she's still keeping watch for you. Where is she, Garnier? What's the final task if I keep digging?" Garnier's face twitched, a flash of panic betraying his silence before he masked it, lips thinning.
"You've got me, Inspector," he rasped, voice strained. "Isn't that enough? Leave the dead to rest. There's no one else." But the lie hung brittle, his gaze darting away, confirming Claudine's role and her danger.
Maigret didn't press further, turning to leave, his composure a steel shield. Garnier's reaction was proof enough. Claudine was real, active, the hidden mastermind, or at least the final enforcer, of a grief-fueled pact. The case teetered. On this twist, not resolved but reignited, testing Maigret's resolve one last time. As grey light seeped through the quay's windows, he prepared to track Claudine Varret, knowing she held the last thread of this tragic web. The murders might be Garnier's hands, but her shadow loomed as the mind still free, ready to strike, to preserve a child's ghost. Maigret's hunt wasn't over. It had just sharpened into a duel with an unseen adversary, one he'd face with every ounce of his weary, relentless genius. The grey dawn broke over Paris with a muted chill as Maigret stood in the shadowed corridor of the Quai des Orfèvres, the echo of René Garnier's fleeting panic over Claudine Varret's name still ringing in his ears. The
last-minute twist, a letter revealing a hidden accomplice, Claudine, the godmother to Garnier's lost daughter Elise, tasked with a final task to protect her memory, had jolted the case from its seeming resolution.
Garnier's confession to the murders of Pierre Fournier and Gérard had unravelled his grief-driven obsession, marked by folded squares and ritualistic order, a response to Julien Bisset's betrayal costing Elise's life 12 years ago. Yet Claudine's shadow, confirmed by Garnier's reaction and the letter's intimate trust, loomed as the unseen hand, possibly the thief of evidence from Maigret's desk, now poised to strike if the past faced further exposure. Maigret's genius, tested by this final turn, steeled itself for the last hunt, knowing justice hung on uncovering this second player before her deadly purpose unfolded. By mid-morning, surveillance reports trickled in from the Belleville tenement, tied to Claudine Varret. The officers Maigret dispatched noted movement, a woman, late 40s, wiry and cautious, matching vague descriptions of a dark-coated figure from Gérard's account, leaving the building with a small satchel just after sunrise. No overt suspicion, but her pace, brisk and purposeful, hinted at intent beyond a morning errand. Maigret, his overcoat heavy with the day's damp, headed to the address himself with Lucas in tow, a quiet urgency driving him. The tenement, a sagging relic squeezed between butcher shops and laundries, reeked of coal smoke and neglect. They approached discreetly, Maigret's bulk a steady presence as he knocked on the weathered door, marked with Varret's faded nameplate, his other hand near the revolver he seldom drew. A tense silence answered, broken by the faint creak of floorboards within. Then the door edged open, revealing a woman, sharp-eyed, gaunt, her dark hair streaked with grey, whose gaze flicked from Maigret to Lucas with predatory wariness. "Claudine Varret?" Maigret asked, voice low, unyielding. "I'm Inspector." Maigret Judicial Police. We've words to share about René Garnier, Elise, and a letter mentioning a final task. Step inside with us, or this ends less civilly. Her face tightened, a flash of recognition. She knew Garnier's fate, before she masked it with a brittle nod, stepping back to let them enter. The cramped room smelled of stale tea and wax, a single table holding a neatly folded cloth napkin, its corners precise, a silent echo of Garnier's ritual. Maigret's pulse steadied. The clue was here, in plain sight, confirming her tie to the obsession. "You've been his shadow," he began, standing near the door to block escape. Lucas, a silent wall beside him. The letter in Garnier's coat names you, thanks you for bearing weights. He couldn't. Evidence stolen from my desk, perhaps Gerard's silence. You're the hand he trusted to finish protecting Elise's memory. What's the final task, Claudine? Another death if I dig too deep. Claudine's eyes, hard as flint, held his, her hands still but tense near her satchel. "You've got Renée," she said, voice low, measured. "Isn't that enough? Elise was my goddaughter, my heart as much as his. Bissay's betrayal killed her, left her broken in that alley while cowards ran. Renée swore order from chaos. I swore to guard what remained. Fournier unearthed filth. Gerard poured at it for coin. I cleaned what I could. Yes, your desk was child's play to slip. But the task? Done, Inspector. No more threats linger. Leave us to grieve." Maigret caught the confession beneath her defiance. The theft admitted, a role in the cover-up clear, though she skirted direct murder. Her
"Done," rang hollow, a lie betrayed by the flicker in her gaze toward the satchel, likely holding a weapon or plans for that final act. "Done?" he echoed, stepping closer, his calm a blade of its own. "Garnier's look when I named you said otherwise. I missed clues early. Folded squares weren't just his tick. They were yours too, shared in grief, etched in the crypt. On Fournier's scraps. Here, on this table. I overlooked the second shadow, the courier who took my evidence while Garnier struck. Victor Leclerc's still under guard, a loose end. Is he next, or am I? Speak, or I tear this place apart for proof. Her?"
composure cracked, hand-jerking to the satchel, but Lucas moved faster, pinning her arm as Maigret seized the bag. Inside, a stiletto, blade gleaming, and a folded map, Belleville marked near Leclerc's guarded lodging, a route traced in ink, dated today. The final task stared back, a plan to silence the last whisper of the past, thwarted by hours. Claudine sagged, resistance draining as cuffs clicked around her wrists. "For Elise," she whispered, eyes distant. "Always for her. We couldn't let her shame live in others' mouths. You've won, Maigret, but you can't bury pain." The truth stood fully revealed as Maigret led her to a waiting car, the drizzle a soft curtain over Belleville's grimy streets. Claudine, Varret, godmother and protector, had been the hidden mind complementing Garnier's hand, stealing evidence, planning strikes, her own grief mirroring his, their shared ritual of folded order, a bond forged in loss. Justice was served, not escaped. Both architects of this tragic spree faced cells now, their mission of erasure halted before Leclerc joined the dead. Maigret's genius had prevailed, peeling back layers others missed, the subtle squares dismissed as quirks with a key, a shared compulsion tying victim to killer to accomplice, overlooked until the pattern emerged. The dark-coated figure Gerard feared wasn't just Garnier, but Claudine, the courier breaching the quay, a detail Maigret hadn't linked until the letter's twist. Back at the quay by afternoon, as statements were taken and reports finalized, Maigret briefed his team, pipe smoke curling as he dissected the missed clues, proving his step ahead. "The folded squares were the thread from the start," he said, voice steady, eyes on the weary faces around him. Fournier's napkin, Gérard's envelope, the crypt's mark. I saw them as staging, not signatures, until they repeated, too often. Madame Claire's offhand note on Fournier's habit was the first crack. I missed its echo in Gérard's clutter, blinded by their fear. The theft felt too neat for Garnier alone. Claudine was the shadow I didn't seek, her stealth, matching a woman's unnoticed entry here. Garnier's confession lacked her name, only his panic at its mention, and the letter's intimacy pointed to her. We nearly lost Leclerc to that oversight. Remember, the smallest tick can scream louder than blood if you listen. The room nodded, respect mingling with exhaustion as Maigret turned to the window, Paris grey beyond. Justice stood, Garnier and Claudine caged, their pain no excuse for murder. Fournier's raincoat riddle, Gérard's silenced fear, Bissey's old sin, all tied to Elise's ghost, now laid to rest in law, if not in their hearts. Yet no triumph lightened Maigret's gaze. He knew pain like theirs didn't vanish behind. Bars and the city held more shadows waiting for another case to call him. He packed his pipe, the ritual his own ordered calm, ready for whatever darkness loomed next over these unforgiving streets. The late afternoon light filtered through the grimy windows of the Quai des Orfèvres, casting long, uneven shadows across Maigret's desk as he packed away the final reports on the Garnier-Varet case. Justice had been served with the arrests of René Garnier and Claudine Varet, the twin architects of a tragic spree driven by grief over Élise Garnier's death. 12 years prior, a loss blamed on Julien Bissey's betrayal in a brutal underworld fallout. The murders of Pierre Fournier and Gérard, marked by folded squares and ritualistic precision, alongside the theft of evidence from Maigret's own drawer, unfolded as desperate acts to shield a child's memory from desecration. Maigret's genius had prevailed, uncovering the shared compulsion in overlooked details, the folded napkins, the crypt's etched mark, the subtle shadow of Claudine as Garnier's unseen hand. Both now sat in cells, their mission of erasure halted before Victor Leclerc joined the dead. Yet, as Maigret tamped fresh tobacco into his pipe, a quiet weight lingered in his chest, the city beyond the glass humming with secrets not fully silenced by this resolution. He rose, pulling on his heavy overcoat against the persistent damp that clung to Paris like a second skin, and stepped into the corridor, the precinct's bustle fading behind him. The case had closed with a clarity that satisfied the law. Garnier's confession, Claudine's intercepted plan to strike Leclerc, the ritual of order tying their pain to their violence, all documented in stark detail for the courts. Maigret had briefed his team, dissecting the missed clues like the folded squares he'd initially dismissed, proving his step ahead even when blindsided by Claudine's hidden role. The prefect had nodded approval. The press would soon spin their grim tale, and yet, as Maigret descended the worn stairs to the street, a minor detail gnawed at the edges of his mind, a splinter refusing to settle. It was the crypt itself, Montparnasse's shadowed heart, where the case's roots lay. During his last visit, when the etched square had crystallized the pattern of Garnier's obsession, Maigret recalled a faint scrawl beneath it, barely legible in the lantern's flicker, a series of numbers or letters too weathered to decipher, on the spot. He'd noted it mentally, prioritizing the trap for Garnier, assuming it was mere graffiti or an unrelated relic of the cemetery's history. But now, with the dust of arrests settling, that scrawl tugged at him. It hadn't matched, the precision of the square appearing haphazard, almost hidden, as if scratched in haste or secrecy. Had it been Bissey's mark before his disappearance, a final clue to his fate, or something later, tied to Elise's accident, a detail Garnier and Claudine overlooked in their crusade to bury the past. Maigret paused at the quay's entrance, the Seine glinting dully under a sky threatening more rain, his pipe unlit between his teeth as he weighed, returning to the crypt. Exhaustion pulled at him, days of relentless pursuit, nights of fractured sleep. But curiosity, that old companion, nudged harder. He could send Lucas or another officer, but this felt personal, a loose thread only his eyes should pull. With a quiet grunt, he hailed a cab, directing it to Montparnasse, the familiar ache in his bones, a reminder that a mystery, even solved, rarely released its grip entirely. The city's labyrinthine secrets mirrored his own stubborn need to understand, to close every door, even if just to hear it click. The cemetery loomed under the waning light as Maigret arrived, its iron gate creaking under his touch, the duplicated key still in his possession, unlocking the crypt's descent. The air below was colder now, damp stone biting through his coat as he raised the lantern, its beams slicing through the gloom to the far wall where the square and scrawl awaited. He crouched, ignoring the protest of stiff knees, and traced the etched mark again. Neat, deliberate, Garnier's signature as he'd deduced. Beneath it, the fainter scratches resolved under closer scrutiny. Not numbers, but letters, crudely formed. JB 12 to 90. Julien Bisset's initials, unmistakably, paired with a date, December 9th, likely from the year of his disappearance 12 years ago, given the weathering. A marker, perhaps, of his last act before vanishing, scratched in a moment of desperation or defiance. Maigret's breath caught, not from shock, but from the ripple of unanswered questions it stirred. Bisset's disappearance had been the spark. For Elise's death, according to Garnier, a betrayal leading to chaos that claimed her. But this scrawl suggested Bisset had been in the crypt, post-betrayal, leaving a trace Garnier and Claudine either missed or ignored in their grief-blind mission. Had Bisset hidden something here beyond the letters Fournier later found? A confession, a debt record or a plea tied to that date, something that might redefine his role, not just a coward who fled, but a man cornered by consequences he couldn't escape. Maigret searched the nearby stone, the trunk, the rubble, finding no further clue tonight, but the date, 12/9, lodged in his mind like a cryptic message, a whisper of another layer to a past he thought he'd unearthed. He straightened, lantern flickering, as he climbed back to the surface, locking the crypt behind him. The scrawl wasn't a threat, not an immediate loose end to endanger Leclerc or others tied to the case, but it hinted at a mystery on the horizon, Bisset's true fate perhaps, or a buried truth neither Garnier nor Claudine had fully silenced. Had Bisset survived beyond that date, or left a legacy still waiting in Paris's underbelly? Maigret knew he wouldn't chase it now. The courts awaited Garnier and Claudine, his desk held other files, and his body craved rest. Yet the question lingered, a quiet itch beneath the satisfaction of justice served, ensuring he'd ponder it over late-night pipes and rainy windows in the days ahead. As he walked away from Montparnasse, the cemetery's silhouettes fading into twilight, Maigret felt the city's pulse around him, taverns murmuring, alleys hiding their own griefs and ghosts. He'd closed this case, explained the hidden clues of folded squares and shared compulsions to his team, proven his relentless
edge.
Fournier's raincoat riddle, Gerard's silenced fear, Elise's tragic shadow, all resolved in the law's harsh light. But Paris never let a detective truly rest. The scrawl's cryptic hint, JB 12/9, was a seed planted, a promise of Another labyrinth to navigate when the next call came. He lit his pipe at last, smoke curling into the damp air, a wry half-smile touching his lips. Justice stood for now, but a mystery never ends. Not in this city, not for him. The next case loomed unseen, and Maigret, weary but unbroken, would be ready to meet its shadows when they beckoned from the fog.